Oh, guys, so many things to talk about. Just going to highlight Sound ID for the world, Dave. That somebody's got to trademark that, because that is so accurate, and it leads into exactly what you're saying, Andy, that the consumer expectation with hearing aids is it is unrealistic, because they're thinking that this device is going to do it all, but the reality is that it doesn't. And I think back to you as a runner. You're not going to go out in your flip-flops and do a marathon in those. You might. I know there's a trend happening in barefoot running, but look, my point is that you're going for a run, you're probably going to put your runners on. You're going to work, you might put your sneakers or your black leather shoes, boots on. You're going out to the beach, you might go barefoot. So you have a choice of what you're going to wear to support your foot or your walking or your running. And it's the same when I'm riding, I wear my bike shoes. It's exactly the same. I say this to a lot of consumers, is that it's exactly the same when it comes to hearing technology now. And I draw the diagram where the hearing technology sits at the top, and under it you've got the medical grade devices. These are your options, and here are the consumer electronics, and these are your options. If you'd like to have improved speech intelligibility in these environments, then hey, these devices over here are going to work really well. And if you're wanting to stream a movie, then these devices here are going to work really well. So I think it's about understanding your consumer needs really intimately and addressing them holistically. Hey, these apps are going to support you really well. All the platforms out there, Android and iOS, have excellent apps. Apple and Now just did Now Transcribe with Apple, that collaboration, using machine learning tech in the background to foster these excellent tools. And Android has Live Transcribe. It's insane how accurate speech to text is these days. So the technology part is just going to evolve so quickly that we're really going to have to, as professionals, embrace this change, I think, and start being strong advocates for it. You know, the clinic of the future. And I loved that episode you did with Mark Trong, where he spoke a bit about the Genius Bar. Let's have clinics that look like the Genius Bar and have access to these hearables and these hearing tech that you can just buy over the counter, and then have these professionals on front or admin on front who can support this to an extent, and they go actually identify that an individual might need prescribed medical grade devices or more, because people don't know what they don't know, and what's on the internet is mind-blowing. Our consumers tell me all the time it is so unclear what's what and who's who in the hearing aid or the hearing world zoo, and it's just next level.
Well, and the thing is there are a few people who can figure all this out for themselves, but most cannot. Where are they going to go to really get set up with the best hearing solution for the different parts of their life? It's going to be the professional.
And it makes me think about the cool changes that are happening in the channels. So we've got the traditional bricks and mortar clinics, the direct consumer models like ours, and then OTC with what's happening with Best Buy releasing the hearing solutions category. You know, you've got these big buy-ins from these brands that have mass consumer foot traffic in the States, for example, and I can only see brands like JB Hi-Fi, which is the Best Buy equivalent, and Harvey Norman's down here doing exactly the same in the next year, the next 12 months. And so that's all the peripheral system is what I talk about. And then when I think about Angela and what she's doing with APD and being the global champion for that, which is excellent. And yes, we don't see each other, as even though we're both in Australia, she's on the East Coast and I'm on the West Coast. It's not that Perth is the most isolated capital city in the world, so I've always been a fan of Zoom calls and video calls for this reason, because we feel so connected. What she's really focusing on, which is what Noom do really well, because they don't have a device, they're an application, is the central part, is this auditory function. So what's happening at that very granular level to get somebody to change their behaviour in a long-term sense. And Dave, I agree, like Noom do it so well. I think I saw I can't remember the article, so I won't quote it or the report that came out, but Noom is in one of the top 5 of being, I hate when I can't quote it exactly, but their growth is exponential and they're growing more and more throughout the world because their subscription model and their customer contact and service is just next level, and the changes and the impact they're having on people from a healthcare perspective is huge. So I think if an application can do that from a psychological ownership point of view, where does hearing healthcare fit in the same regard?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think like, and for those that aren't aware, Noom is basically I know the like main use case of it is to lose weight. I think they're expanding into like other lifestyle changes. But the big thing that it does is it it basically is it's a behavioral application where you have to fill out this like all of this information, and then it periodically like checks in with you and you're sharing information with it all the time. And as time goes on, it learns more and more about your behaviors. It starts to understand why you're eating at certain times, and it starts to try to kind of like bring to light maybe some of the reasons, like, are you really stressed out right now? And so the whole idea behind it is that as it learns more about you, it becomes like a buddy, and it helps you to really understand like what's going on with that behavior. And then it gradually nudges you toward a healthier behavior. And I know I was talking to Chris Cardinal the other day, who's, with Amplify. He said he lost 50 pounds on it. And Delane Wright, who I interviewed on here, he had his daughter's wedding coming up and he lost like 25 pounds on it too. And both of them said the same thing, which is it like gets in your head and it starts to really recognize like better than you even know yourself. It starts to really like you'll get like a notification at a time where you typically will go and eat that, like, you'll get into the freezer and you'll start eating that pint of ice cream, and it will like say, hey, you typically go and you eat ice cream around this time. And so like, again, going back to your question, Kat, like what does this look like in the world of hearing healthcare? Because I like to look at like what's actually going on outside of this industry and then try to think through like, well, how will that ultimately make its way around? So again, you have this combination of an all-day device, a device that's going to probably be laden with sensors. So you're going to get some biometric information. So you're going to have an even stronger feedback loop of the information you're feeding these things. And then the third is going to be the ability to like have almost, this is where I'm so fascinated with everything that's going on in the voice technology space, is the conversational AI piece, because a lot of that, like, I'm not saying general AI and a sentient thing. I'm saying more of just being able to do the input of the questions that Noom's issuing to your phone today. Imagine if you have that as something that's in your ear. So like the hearing, the device that you're wearing in there, I think is going to be really, really important for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. And so again, it like begs this question of like, where does that like lead itself in terms of the opportunity for the provider? And I think there's a multitude. I mean, I think that it just might better inform the provider about the overall experience the patient's having. And then also I think there's, like you said, like behavioral and psychological elements of this that might tell a broader story. So there's just so much going on in this regard, but I think that the ear is such and by extension, the hearing care professional of, basically servicing this device and providing an optimal device fit and experience for all of these new applications. Like we're seeing the first foray of this with podcasting and all of like people just gradually moving more and more toward audio. And I just continue to think like follow that out across the next few years, and it's going to just explode in more and more ways. And I think there's going to be lots of different opportunities, but again, it all revolves back around to the fact of if you're a provider and if you just want to only kind of do what was the status quo like 10 years ago, and you don't want to have these conversations about the broader possibilities that this might pertain to, and looking at it, like Andy said, like the lifestyle, the enhancements that can be had here, or the ways in which you'd want to use that technology to better facilitate all of these things that you do throughout your life, you're kind of like shortchanging the patient. And when there's all kinds of new places like Best Buy that you can go and you can get fit with that, you have to ask yourself the question, how am I different from the patient journey, like in the patient experience, than any of these other channels? And if you can't answer that question, I'm not sure you can charge a premium for that. And I think that's kind of the existential question right now, is like, what does this look like? And I think there's some really, really exciting different routes. But the fact of the matter is the technology itself and the ecosystem of applications that this is going to tether into is going to become just more and more robust as time goes on.
Totally. And I think if you're thinking, oh, this is a bit out there, I think you think about the brands out there like Spotify and Strava, and others that do the yearly wrap up for their customers. If that doesn't tell you that people want to know what's my top song, what's my, how many hours have I spent in the bike this year running, if you can't do that yearly wrap up for each individual person out there, and you're just doing it in a blanket sense, then you've misunderstood people and healthcare in general. And I think what I love about Strava, because I looked at it last night as their wrap up and their really unsung subscription model in the health and wellness space, they're in the billions of dollars, is that they take that data and they say, hey, you've done this amount of climbing this year, you've done this amount of exercise in these categories, and I know I haven't had an outstanding year, but I'm so, it's my data, and I love looking at that. Same with Spotify and any other application you can think of. I think there's going to be a yearly wrap-up. I think that's going to be the trend. People want to know, hey, for example, did I listen to a lot of audio content? Hey, you're on this many virtual calls maybe, and then you've been at a lot of noisy environments, brackets, cafes, restaurants. Here's your breakdown there, and here are some maybe applications that you use in the bracket. I think our customers would really love seeing that, and then that just motivates them more to change their behaviour. It builds this beautiful baseline that they can see in a neat format and go, hey, I know how I can get better and better in the long run.
I love that, because now you can also imagine your hearing care provider taking that data and say, okay, you do a lot of podcast listening. How is the listening experience for you? And address that part of their lifestyle and try and make it as good as possible. Okay, you spend a lot of time on Zoom calls. Well, what's your setup for Zoom calls, all right? Let's see if we can improve your auditory experience during Zoom calls. So not only the person wearing the device, but the hearing care professional can address a person's lifestyle based on what their year in review is recording them as having done. And Spotify kind of triggered another thought too, and that's what's happening in the music world. All the music streaming services are going to high-def audio and high-res audio. And, well, high-res audio more or less relies on you having pretty good hearing. And if you look at just the averages for hearing or age-related hearing loss, even a person in their 40s may not have clinical hearing loss, because in the auditory part of the spectrum, they're still maybe only 10 dB down, but the treble is really going. And so they're losing the high-res experience unless you do hearing personalization. And that end of the industry is starting to come together. You see more earbuds doing hearing personalization. I think you're going to start to see the tie-in with high-res audio. Because if I'm selling high-res audio, I want to make sure people can hear it and appreciate the difference and be willing to pay for it. Well, the only way you can make that happen is through hearing personalized earphones or headphones. And so it's another way to drive recognition of hearing, and how by addressing your hearing, you'll have a better listening experience. So all of these things coming together. I think when we have this conversation, even a couple of years from now, we're going to see a very changed environment from today.
And I love that we'll be able to do that in reflection when we said in 2021. That blows my mind as well. These are like nice little libraries and podcasts for our reflections. But yeah, the high res is something we cannot discount. That's going to be like next level if whoever can test in that higher frequency range with good quality results and accuracy, they'll really have a unique market, because the audiogram is great. It's a very useful tool, but it is, like you said, also quite limiting. You can show someone in their 40s having what we deem normal hearing, but in the extended high frequency range, a hearing loss, which is actually affecting their overall quality of life.
You said something too at the beginning of the conversation, Andy, that I thought is worth circling back on, which is, kind of like what the OTC regulations will usher in, more broadly speaking, from a global standpoint, because yes, it is a very US centric, piece of legislation, obviously, but I fully agree. And so I think what's interesting here is to think about, I often think about, some of these parts of the world, that, whether it's Africa, India, China, where, you kind of look like at a really high level, in a way, some of these parts of the world actually have an advantage over some of these like more historical, quote unquote, first world countries, in the sense that, America, for example, is kind of mired in all of our legacy infrastructure. And so it's really hard for us to like go and just completely overhaul everything. And so you look at places like China, and they have like, it's basically what a city looks like, or a country looks like, full of cities, with technology and the state of architecture being more like in the 1970s and on. And so they've kind of leapfrogged in a sense. And you can kind of see this happening with mobile banking in, sub-Saharan Africa, where they don't have a lot of like the legacy banking infrastructure. And so they were able to just kind of like leapfrog right into this. And I think that what's interesting with like taking that particular theme and applying it to hearing healthcare, well, what's really exciting is that when you have parts of the world where there's, 1 million people to one hearing care provider, like clearly you need some alternative way to treat all of these different people. And so, where we are today, heading into 2022, you have, you basically have a combination of ubiquitous smartphones, and that's just increasing. Parts like India, again, sub-Saharan Africa, that you have this like just hockey stick of penetration of these different wireless devices that, will basically be the device that's tethered to these types of, hearing care devices that will be much, much more affordable. And so I think like, you look at like what HearX is doing, for example, and this idea of having, again, it's like, it's Devet Svanpool, who's like an audiologist, and he's a really, really well-respected audiologist who's leading the charge with this. And so that it's actual science that this thing's rooted in, but it's a self-fit device that caters to these parts of the world that are just now kind of coming online and even made possible to have these things. And so I could see there being a scenario where I was getting at with that original point was like, there's no real like status quo that exists. So you could see there being a massive amount of adoption if the circumstances are right, to where you have a lot of really good low cost devices that are self-programmable and self-fit. And then you think about like, there's going to be so many advantages to that from a global standpoint of not only are you treating all those people, you're actually also going to be able to pool a whole lot more data. And the data is going to tell a really interesting story too, where you can see like, I think much more specifically what's going on with our global health population in terms of hearing loss and then some of the comorbidities associated with it. I think it's just going to be a huge boon. And I think, again, going what you were saying at the beginning is like, I think that OTC is going to be important in the US, but I agree with you that what it's emblematic of is, I think, a much bigger deal for the rest of the world.
Absolutely. In fact, the tech developed for OTC is going to have strong and positive global implications. And I look at it this way. If you're in a developing country, you don't have access to an audiologist, even a 70 or 80% solution is better than a 0% solution, right? Okay, so you don't go to an audiologist and you don't get a real ear measurement, and you don't make 3 trips and get it tuned just so and have it just perfect, right? An 80% solution is still way better. And even in developed countries, I think the evolution towards a hybrid model achieves the same thing. Let's say I'm a rural person and maybe I'm disabled, or it's difficult for me to travel the 50 miles to my audiologist. If I get set up with a hybrid solution, like say what GN is going to do at Lively, where you have both, remote, you have self-fitting with a professional care option, or what's happening with Hologo, Sonova in Australia, right? So I can get a HelloGo device if I'm in Australia, and I can self-fit it. I can press the button, hook up with a hearing care professional, and get it fine-tuned later on. So I might start with an 80% solution, and it does a lot of good. And then when I'm able to get to the audiologist, I can have it tweaked. So regardless of where you are, you're going to get better hearing care. And I think OTC is partly driving that directly by the device development, and indirectly and the way it's starting to influence the way people look at hearing care delivery overall. And of course, Kat, you were way ahead of the game there with Hearing Collective. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about all that.
I was just going to say, you actually hit the nail on the head there. First of all, legacy. What we have always done, will we always do. And I know that in the way we all live in Australia and the US, it's actually quite hard to change that behaviour. Mum says just go to the doctor and they'll sort that out and give you the referral to here and there. That's sort of ingrained. That is ingrained from a very young age. So I think about what you were saying, Dave, and it's actually really exciting, and you're right, Dave and Andy, that is a 70 or 80% solution better than nothing. And I agree with that. And I actually think that statement is quite applicable to a lot of our consumers in the Australian, the US, the UK, New Zealand market. Because a lot of people, well, I think of it this way, is if someone comes to me and they've got a moderate hearing loss and they say they want a device like a hearable, I talk through expectations and I give them my professional recommendation. And then they have this hesitancy towards the professional recommendation. And I say, well, when I check in with them 2 weeks later, I say, what have you decided to do about it? And they say, nothing. And I've been talking to this other colleague, Sophie Bryce. She's quite ahead of her time as well. She worked with Elaine Saunders when Bellavia Saunders was originally set up. And we talk about these theories because we're doing a bit of research next year, where I think is a solution better than no solution. So if someone comes to you with a mild hearing loss and then you say, oh, your hearing loss is only mild, and you don't give them a solution, even though it might just be situational then and there, what are the long-term impacts of that behaviour you're actually embedding into your client? And if hearables and OTCs can fit into the hearing difficulties mild, moderate hearing category, is it not a disservice that you don't encourage them strongly to use it there? And I think there was this famous study done by Lieberman and Kiang in '87 where they put a cat in a soundproof room, and they essentially showed that it had. I'm really bad at recording because I've read so much recently and I haven't gone back and consolidated. But what they essentially showed with this cat was that the auditory pathways had remapped because they weren't stimulating their peripheral senses, and one of those was hearing. So my theory when I was talking to Sophie and Elaine as well is that I think the opportunity with hearables devices, let's say they become device agnostic, is how do you change that person's behaviour to be proactive sooner, because we know the implications of untreated hearing loss. And Peter Blamey himself did a lot of research in the implant space where they tracked when he redid a study in 2012, I think it was, and they followed individuals who had moderate sloping to profound hearing losses and how their cognition looked then thereafter, and those who didn't have implants, and the theory followed strong as well, that if you don't use those auditory pathways, the executive functions of your brain remaps and you behave differently. How it's expressed is differently and all this. So the opportunity is insanely large for us to be at the forefront of everybody's healthcare mind, and this is why I love partnerships like Skull Candy and Mimi Technology, because it's their target market are young adults, 20-year-olds below, and they're doing stuff with voice tech as well. It's just, the world's a crazy place for hearing healthcare at the moment. Excitingly crazy for me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, what's fascinating, so this is actually the second conversation I've had in a row where I've referenced this, because the last time I just had this was on Future Ear when I was interviewing Jill Davis about Cognivue, and she said the big light bulb moment she had with, basically the link between cognition and hearing was very similar to yours. I don't remember who the research audiologist was that she was sitting in a presentation, but the big connection I had when she was describing it was when I interviewed David Eagleman. And with David Eagleman, his book Livewired, that's the whole premise of the book, is that
that popped into my head right away when she started talking.
Yeah, it's like, so you have your brain, the neuroplasticity of it, it's constantly rewiring itself. So that makes so much sense to me. And it's like, this is probably more pronounced than ever now with masks, because you're removing the ability for people to read lips. And so what's happening is you literally have, like you said, the executive functions of the brain, you have portions of the brain that are actually now taking these tasks over from the auditory processing pathways. And so again, it speaks to this theme that like there's so much more going on here than like simply turning the volume knob down on somebody's ears. It's much more closely linked to what's actually happening inside of your brain. And again, we're talking about what's the role of the audiologist in the future. That's another path that you can totally go down, is helping people to understand what's happening more holistically here, rather than just limiting it to, well, it looks like you can't really, your audiogram shows me this. So that's a really interesting track here that I just wanted to touch on, because again, 2 times in a row, I've gotten to talk about David Eagleman's awesome book that I got to interview him about.
Livewire. Okay, I'll have to read that.
It's on one of the shelves behind my head.
Excellent recommendation. I'll get a copy. Thank you.
Livewired. It's very good. So anyway, I figure, as we kind of wrap up here, it's just always exciting talking with you two, because I think that all 3 of us are pretty optimistic about the way in which this space is moving. I see there just being, it's win-win-win. Like, I think that at the end of the day, the consumer, the patient, they're going to really win out. I really feel strongly about that. I think the professional has a gigantic opportunity ahead of them, or actually a multitude of opportunities in lots of different like sub paths that you can go down and specialize in. And then I think that a lot of these companies have a lot of opportunity too. I mean, again, like Nuheara is a great example of, Nuheara's been here basically as long as I've known you two, which feels like 5 years now. And it's like, what's so exciting about them, and I feel like they're such a good representation of the hearable space, and why I always have taken it so serious, is look at the first iteration, then look at the second iteration of the IQ Buds, then look at the third, then I think they're on like the 4th now. And it's just gotten like light years better every single year. And this is a lot of what Andy and I have talked about from the start, which is like, well, what's driving that innovation? A lot of it's being driven by what's happening inside of the device. The chip development, the move toward these digital signal processing chips, and how much better they've gotten. Now we're at this stage where you have like these crazy new combinations of technology where you have, we've talked about it a bunch on here before, but the, Andy, with your company, with the Knowles AI Sonic chip, and how that now plays home to something like Giles from Chattable, his like AI processor. And so you have like this device that now has like this computational ability to run these like speech and like the real-time processing of speech, so that you can start to solve things like speech and noise. And so it's like I just feel like we're at this point where it's like a runaway train of technology, and it's like it's left the barn, and it's a matter of now like how do we take advantage of this like runaway acceleration of this innovation that is 100% ushering in a dizzying amount of change. But I think that like it can be harnessed in such a way where, again, whether it's the patients, the consumer, or the patients, the provider, or the companies that reside behind these offerings, I think there's just a ton of opportunity to go around.
Yeah, Dave and Andy, it's just been a really insightful discussion again today. I got goosebumps a lot of the time with the way we all think of the future and envision it. It's quite win-win for everybody involved. I'm such a big advocate for proactive healthcare. I come from the legacy in my family is healthcare. And I've worked in an array of places, private clinic, not-for-profits, aged care homes, disability sector as well. And I think something I think about often in hearing health is that I used to think that I'd be able to shift the needle in regards to adoption rate of hearing technology earlier. But now that I'm getting deeper and deeper into the space, I'm understanding that this will probably be my career, which is awesome. It totally excites me. And I think everything we've discussed today, from the channel, how consumers or patients access hearing healthcare, the service model, it's going to be a bit more clinician-led or client-led, and the technology that's out there, I think that's a really good framework to be thinking about how you as a professional fit into it, or you as a hearing aid manufacturer fit into it, or you as a consumer fits into it, because if you take that framework away, you can pretty much get access to some level of care or service that you will need. And for me, when people come to me in their early 40s or 50s and they want to do something about it, or I can impart some knowledge translation from a healthcare perspective, and they take my recommendations on board and implement these earlier behaviour changes, that is really promising to me and really exciting. So I'm really hopeful for the future. Things don't happen overnight, but in the same regard, who knows, will it be one of those big consumer electronic brands that just comes in and really tips that scale in regards to having hearing health adoption scale exponentially? Andy?
Yeah, I think a couple of months ago I did a panel for the Future Source Audio Collaborative on convergence, hearing convergence. And at the beginning of it, Anders Jessen of WSA did a terrific talk. And I really recommend going to the Future Source website and playing it back, because he talked about the evolution of WSA's thinking in terms of OTC, and how everybody was resistant at first. But then he said, we began to realize that this was the way to address the mild to mid-market, which is the lion's share of people with hearing health. And he actually said, it's not like we haven't been trying for the last 40 years, acknowledging the fact that the legacy model was not working for those people. And that, in fact, when you bring people into the hearing care system earlier, then they lead a better lifestyle and carry on at whatever stage they end up in their journey as they grow older. And I think, he said that it's not like we haven't been trying to, serve these people for the last 40 years. I think 10 years from now, that's going to be a completely different conversation. Everything coming together finally is going to crack that nut. And I think on the consumer side too, as you see the consumer companies coming in, they're going to change people's attitudes about hearing. Just like you said, Kat, what kind of shoes do you put on? Right. When I go out there and do a long training run, I've got trainers that keep my, aging knees, alive. When I go to the starting line, I put the racing flats on, right? And well, for people at all stages of hearing loss, there's going to be a device and a care model for them, all up and down the ladder. And it is very exciting as a consequence, where the global pandemic of untreated hearing loss is finally going to get treated.
Well said. Well said. Well, thank you two very much for joining me here. Thanks for everybody who tuned in here to the end, and we will chat with you next time.